All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to hear out this presentation on data collection methods. Um, my name is Krista. I am the Research and Evaluation Coordinator, and we are doing a webinar series on data on evaluation and research overall. This presentation is, I think, the third in the webinar series that we have so far. I am joined today by Sara, who is part of our team at API-GBV, and she's based in San Francisco. I am calling in remotely from Southwest Florida. And so a bit more about our mission at Asian Pacific Institute on gender-based violence. We have a mission very similar to everyone as direct service providers, but we are not a direct service organization. But we have a similar mission of disrupting gender-based violence, which causes physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual, and economic harm within our AA and HPI communities throughout the US and territories. We are a training and technical assistance provider, and we work with community-based organizations and some mainstream organizations, but we work with the direct service providers who are working with our community members who come from all of these various countries. I like to include this slide to remind everybody about the wide swath of folks who we serve. I am just getting rid of myself now so you can see the entire graphic, but I'm calling to mind when I say AANHPI or AAPI or MENA, this is inclusive of folks from the Central Asian region, from West Asia, from the Pacific Islands, as well as East Asian, Southeast Asian, and South Asian populations and communities. So a bit about our agenda for today. Some housekeeping moments as well. We will be going through ways in which we can collect data. We will be looking at the types of data and a definition about what data is. We also will be considering some ethics and other considerations when you are deciding on what ways that you will be using to collect data and information, whether it's research or evaluation. I will pause and I will have some reflection questions for you. And this is also a great opportunity for you to ask any questions of me. And I also will be sharing some resources in the form of a handout. And all of these things will be compiled in an email afterwards, in which you will find the slides and a recording of this presentation as well. As I said, I ask that you hold your questions till the end of this presentation during that dedicated time. However, if you have any questions that arise as you hear this presentation, you can also put them in the chat box, and I will do my best to pull them out and revisit them once we have the question section. So to begin, thinking about the definition of what data even is, we can think of data as raw facts, observations, words, stories, images, and other types of useful information. The way that we can leverage this data and make that information useful is when we can organize and analyze these stories, words, images, observations, facts in a meaningful and systematic way. This is applicable to both research and evaluation. Both research and evaluation will use typically numbers and stories together. So one of the reasons why I'm even defining quantitative and qualitative data is because it may come up in conversation if you're speaking with managers, directors, or funders. And I wanted to provide this definition so that you have the vocabulary and the way to communicate that you are in fact collecting, for example, quantitative or numerical data. Some examples include counts, averages, or modes. And typically that is presented in charts, tables, and graphs in any reports that you may be collecting or developing and things of that nature. In terms of qualitative, you likely are already collecting words and stories and sharing that information. And typically that looks like creating themes, categories, or pulling direct quotes about, for example, successes or challenges that you may have been encountering. And the reason why I bring up both quantitative and qualitative is that they really work in tandem together, and qualitative can provide the story about the numbers that you are collecting. So one of the questions and thinking about why we even want to collect data, we definitely do not want to collect information for the sake of simply having the information. As I said before, you are likely already keeping track of data in your role, whatever that may be, whether that is through your notes, case notes, or you are tracking the number of workshop attendees, or looking at the total nights of shelter or hotline calls that eventually become cases, for example. So really the purpose is to uncover areas of strength or need in programming and at your organization, and thinking about ways that this data can be used to inform and enhance the services that are being provided. It can also be helpful to understand how data can be collected and analyzed, because this is a very strong way to present evidence about the successes and challenges of your organization or program. I said before that it should not be collected simply for the sake of collecting data. It should be data that is useful. And again, it should not be information that you think is going to be used against you. We hope that any data collection practices are aimed towards improving programs, or simply touching base with if program expectations are realistic and in line with anticipated results. So this is simply a slide that shares the overview of the types of data and the ways that you can gather this information. I will be going in depth in the next few slides about the ways in which we can do these, but data collection could look like developing surveys, individual interviews, hosting listening sessions, observations. So this could be in person or virtually, as well as looking at existing data. So this could include looking at annual reports, both internal or external facing reports. This also could look like if your organization has a website, pulling down what resources are being accessed most, or what website pages are being accessed most by folks in the community. I also want to bring to mind the fact that there are other ways to collect data as well, including images. They don't necessarily need to be just verbal or written information. So this is also an overview about the ways in which the data and the types of data collection methods can be organized. And this is a graphic that just shows that they could be both quantitative or qualitative. I have this information in the event that you are looking to build evidence. So for example, if you are writing for a grant, these quantitative measures might be helpful to include as evidence for strong culturally specific methods, or it could be evidence that if there are not experimental or meta-analyses about your research or evaluation topic, that there is a need to develop more research or evaluation for these topics. We also see that if you are developing surveys, observations, if you're looking at existing data, you're able to collect both quantitative and qualitative data in those types of data collection methods. If you are looking at developing interviews, having group interviews or focus groups and listening sessions, or if you're looking at ethnographic ways to collect data, these ways of collecting data will be more towards words, stories, and qualitative forms of data. And so for our communities and typically for evaluation purposes, there are also other ways that you are probably already collecting data that are more culturally responsive. In the next couple of slides, I will be expanding more on smaller ways to collect data that aren't necessarily these full-length interview questions or online survey questionnaires or even in-person survey questionnaires. So in this next section, I will be providing a deeper dive into the different types of ways that we can collect data and some of the advantages and considerations for each method. So here I have the survey and questionnaire methods. Some of the advantages for this type of data collection method include the cost effectiveness. So there are ways to have and collect survey information through online and free means virtually. And then also you're able to use, for example, just a written document and share that to gather surveys as well. Additionally, even if you are providing a longer online virtual survey, you also have the option to offer people to call in. For example, if you have a bilingual staff member who can go through a survey with a participant in the language that they are most comfortable with using. However, this kind of delves into some of the considerations for that. There is a need to consider the time it takes to translate services and looking at the capacity that your organization has to provide the surveys in the appropriate languages or the languages that our communities need. So the best case scenario would be having the translated surveys in the necessary languages beforehand, as well as having interpreters for lower literacy populations, if that is the topic, or those are the community members that you are hoping to reach in your research and evaluation. So there is a need to budget both for capacity and for the budget for these in advance. I also want to share that before you are implementing these, there's a need to test the questions to ensure that they are simple enough. You could test them with staff and with whoever is developing the project. And simpler language and shorter surveys are more culturally relevant for our communities. In addition, I am dropping this resource, which is a domestic violence evidence project, for examples of surveys and sexual violence and domestic violence survey tools that may be helpful for your work. Very similar are individual interviews. One of the benefits of this method of collecting data is the fact that it allows for very rich, complex discussion, and it is also private. There are also ways to collect individual interviews in a way that is less formal. And we have this conversation guide for check-ins as part of our monitoring and evaluation curriculum. And it is a less invasive way to get information from community members. And it is also less time intensive, for example. This is the link here, but it will take you to our monitoring and evaluation curriculum if you are interested. Some considerations, however, for developing individual interview questions, similar to developing survey questions, are a need to ensure that these questions are resonant with the population that you are targeting in terms of your evaluation or your research work to gauge and estimate. Oh, I am sorry that you are not allowed access through this link. I will be sharing a handout that will take you to register for the monitoring and evaluation course in the handout. Sorry about that. But it could be overwhelming for individuals if there are too many questions. So there's just a need to pilot test and ensure that the language is appropriate for your community and for the folks that you are trying to reach. I also have a note that it can be helpful to consider recording for the purposes of note taking. However, for things like shorter check-ins, I would advise not to have those recorded. And also just to have like a dump of your reflections on those more brief conversations after the fact and after you are finished with those quicker check-ins. So similar to individual interviews or group interviews, we also use the term listening sessions, and typically they have very similar advantages. Other advantages include the ability to look at any community dynamics or group dynamics. Another unintended benefit to having listening sessions is that participants can hear from folks who are in a similar role or have similar experiences to them, which can really help with gaining insight about your research or evaluation questions. Some considerations when you are developing listening sessions include setting group agreements in order to ensure that there is mutual respect and ongoing consent and just mutual agreement within a group. There's also a need to be clear about the intent of a project and the ways in which that data will be used after the fact. There's also a need to ensure that participants are accredited if they would like to be. And if you are quoting anybody, some people might prefer to use a pseudonym. Other people may not want to have their name affiliated with the link or with the quotations that you may be pulling out. And other folks might want to be completely anonymized and do not want their organization or any information about them to be tied back to any quotes. The same goes for individual interviews as well. So another form of collecting data or another way to think about looking at data or analyzing data is to look at existing raw data. So the advantages of this are the fact that you do not have to invest as much time into the collection stage of your research or evaluation work. And this can be used to supplement any other types of data collection methods. And it can be helpful to give more context to the numbers that you might be collecting. It also is less of a lift in terms of capacity for staff and can be less intrusive. However, there are some substantial considerations before selecting this method of collecting data, in that if you're looking at data that already exists out there, you might not be able to get that direct link towards your specific evaluation or research questions. And so the ways that the data are collected might not align with your goals for your project. You also have less control over the types of information that can be collected since it already is out there. So there might be some substantial missing information or data. This can be particularly challenging when working with our communities in that there might already be some demographic information that you will not be able to change or alter. And so really, I would recommend looking at existing data to supplement other forms of data collection that you might choose. This is similar to the previous slide, but this is looking at any existing documents in terms of reports that have already been written or collected. For example, this could look like comparing a year to year end of year reports from your organization and you could use this to look at changes in needs or successes over time. This has very similar advantages to the method I mentioned in the previous slide, and it can be useful again to give context to some of the numbers because you could see the tracking of changes and needs over time. However, again, these might not directly address any of your specific evaluation or research questions. And again, this would be best supplemented with any other form of data collection, such as looking at surveys or conducting listening sessions. So here on this slide, I just have some more examples about ways that data is collected. For example, even if you're asking questions individually, there is a need to check in or ensure that you have someone's full attention and they have your attention. And then some follow-up steps for reflecting on this type of data collection includes jotting down your notes afterwards, thinking about what you gleaned from your conversations. This could also look like debriefing with a colleague to hear their thoughts to ensure that both of you are along the same page, thinking about what the type of information you gathered after you have a listening session or an interview. So if you are looking at more quantitative methods, the analysis of these methods include the explanation and the context as to why these numbers are important to collect. So this could look like displaying your findings in a chart or a graph, and there's really a need to think about your intended audience for this information and ensuring that it is readable for your audience. Again, I will be providing a link to our monitoring and evaluation curriculum at the end of this presentation. And so for this portion of the presentation, I will be sharing some considerations in terms of ensuring that the data and any information that you are collecting is secure and that you are able to ensure that this information is protected. And so as advocates and folks in direct services, you already know the best practices to protect the identity and confidentiality for survivors. So this is just extending that information to the data that you are gathering. So some of the best practices include ensuring that when you are collecting data, it is stored in password-protected clouds or drives. Other practices include making sure that sensitive information is de-identified. This could look like using initials instead of names. And then thinking about when you are sharing back this information and your findings, the reports and any outcomes from your evaluation and data collection should cover general themes, and no individual entire survey response or entire response to individual interviews should be too identifying so that you can trace them back to any one individual person. If you are thinking about, for example, writing in a report, you can share ways about a person. You can share information about an individual without being too identifying. For example, if you wish to share some client success stories or any triumphs that your organization may have, you could still share in your report some parts of the person's background or the language that they speak without sharing their specific town or city, for example. So in this portion, I am going to be sharing some additional considerations when conducting research and analysis with our communities and just thinking about evaluation and research and its history overall. Our communities may not necessarily trust evaluation or research methods. And so thinking through this, there's just a need to ensure and let participants know that their information will not be traced back to them individually if they don't want that to be linked to them. Again, before listening sessions or before interviews, it's important to make sure that participants have a say in how quotes are attributed to them, if they would like them to be attributed, and just keeping in mind the ways that they would like to be sourced or cited. This also could mean choosing not to record in terms of making sure that there is trust when you're collecting data. This also could look like assigning another team member to take some notes or observations if you're working in teams that have capacity for multiple folks during the data collection process. Some other considerations are that researchers and evaluators have a duty to prevent unintended consequences when possible. So in person, this could look like reminding people where the nearest bathrooms are and the nearest exits are, thinking about trauma-informed practices, if they need a time away, if they need a bio break, or if they need space away from a listening session, or if they need to take a break from a survey, for example. When collecting any form of data, it's important, again, working with providers and advocates and survivors, that folks have that space to show up in the ways that they can. And as folks who are implementing research or evaluation, we have a duty not to traumatize or replicate harmful power dynamics through research or evaluation. Some ways to get to the common ground include having those group agreements, setting ground rules, and other ways to practice transparency, and holding space for talking about potentially challenging topics, such as domestic violence. And so that could also include providing resources after the data collection methods to ensure that folks are connected to the resources that they may need as a result of discussing these topics. This could also look like, from a culturally specific perspective, making sure that folks know you're also coming from a trauma-informed perspective. It might be easier for folks to open up in person for listening sessions after sharing food and drink, if that is within budget, or if you have that opportunity to do so. And then it also could look like some other practices to ensure that community members know that it's safe enough for them to fully participate. Some other considerations are the fact that evaluation and research can have connotations of extraction and surveillance in our communities. So there is a need to acknowledge the subject matter expertise and lived experiences of advocates and survivors in the room. I try to make sure to ensure that everyone who attends and participates is thanked after they are participating or after they complete a listening session. And then one thing that I would recommend and think about are, if you are able to, finding ways to compensate participants for their time, especially for longer commitments such as interviews or listening sessions. This doesn't necessarily need to be a monetary way to thank people. For example, if you are running a survey, you could enter participants into a raffle to win a gift card, for example. Or you could offer virtual gift cards for participants if you have the budget. And so as you are planning research and evaluation, and before even you get to the data collection stage, it's important to budget out for these considerations and the ways that we want to ensure that people are compensated for their time. And then speaking to ensuring that evaluation and research are culturally relevant and meeting communities where they're at, I wanted to share that some considerations include being mindful around cultural holidays, partnering and encouraging community leaders to be present in the data collection phase, but also throughout the research and evaluation planning stages. Some culturally specific ways to ensure that we're meeting community where they're at include getting to harder questions after a meal or snack if that is relevant to in-person data collection methods. And then also thinking about opening or closing sessions with a blessing if that is relevant to our communities. And this is a theme that I think runs throughout this presentation, but there is just a very important need to budget for all of these considerations, even before the data collection phase of your projects. So in terms of thinking about that logistically, sometimes that looks like ensuring that the scheduling and the time works around various time zones. If you are working across states, or even if you are working locally, ensuring that participants are able to work around their schedules. Additional logistical concerns include ensuring that you have enough time to develop translated materials and that you have access to interpreters if needed. For smaller scale teams, this can be extremely tricky. While you could use bilingual staff, it is important to ensure that there are multiple people who are able to interpret to ensure that communication for longer sessions is preserved and the quality of interpretation is preserved. For something smaller, such as check-ins, people who are attending a program regularly may not be comfortable speaking directly with someone that they see every week. So thinking about that and making sure that they're comfortable with sharing their actual experiences, maybe that looks like having a survey instead or having someone else come in to share if they have any concerns and make sure that they're comfortable sharing those and expressing those. Here I have a need to plan for creativity and flexibility when working with our communities. And I mean that in a way to think ahead of time and in plan for any potential challenges that you may encounter. So in terms of like logistical concerns, that could look like ensuring you have paper copies of surveys ahead of time if you are having surveys or listening sessions in person. Ensuring that you have all of the tools that you need, such as charging your laptop, bringing a clicker for presentations, having paper notes if people want to jot down their reflections in person, as well as sharing resources with people to ensure that if something arises that is a challenging topic for them, they are able to access the resources that they need after you are collecting this data to ensure, again, that they have access to the things that they need. I also wanted to take this time to provide an example relevant to survey concerns, even for smaller scale surveys, in terms of some best practices. One challenge that, as part of the research team, we encountered was we were getting a bunch of junk responses or spam-like replies for some of our online surveys. And so thinking about these potential ways that can slow the data collection ahead of time can help when you are planning your research and evaluation concerns, as we took a little bit more time to comb through and clean that data to ensure that the people who were responding were not bots and were really folks who had those experiences that we were seeking out to hear about. So I am going to pause here for some reflection questions. Please feel free to share this in the chat box or to share this off mute. But was there what from this presentation so far was most helpful to you? And I wanted to ask if there are any specific data collection methods that you think should get their own webinar. Amber says in chat, I really appreciated the reminder to consider various cultural holidays before planning to collect data. Yes, I'm glad that was helpful to you. If neither of these questions are really speaking to you, please feel free also to take this time now to share any questions that you might have for me. What was most helpful was the tips. Would like a webinar of how to form the questions and what questions to utilize. However, the resources provided may help. Thank you, Anna. I actually am going to share the resource right now in terms of my handout that will provide specific tools that might answer your question. And if they do not answer your question, let me move over to the next slide to share some of these resources and also our contact information here. I can also share my email in the chat if you have specific assistance that you would like for your own surveys or things of that nature. We are a technical assistance provider, and I would be happy to help with any individual questions you may have.
Krista, can you go back to the slide before?
Yes, hold on.
Okay, thank you.
To answer a couple of the questions that you posed for us for reflection, I think for me, I'm a director of a helpline, and it's a helpline that provides domestic violence advocacy. And I think the why do we collect data is the piece of like the why has like multiple audiences. And so I think there's this piece of like something that can feel like a heavier lift is a heavier emphasis is because of funders, but it's trying to bring along folks who are providing the direct service of the meaning making why we need to ask certain demographic questions and the importance of data entry. So for me, to think about like what would be a helpful next training could be like how to provide the meaning making for direct service staff of the importance of collecting data. And it's not just for reporting purposes, it's also for trauma informed like continuum of care. So the more documentation you're able to provide, the next person who's supporting them. So I think I always look for more opportunities to help with bringing trauma informed data reporting into the meaning making for staff who are entering the data around the services and impact they're having with client engagement.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Shaida. As you pointed out, this is more of an overview to a more general audience, but that would be a great follow-up topic to this presentation. Thank you for your response.
Can I jump in? I also
Yes,
feel
please.
that um, a lot of yes to everything that Shaida said, and the fact that for folks that work within the AANHPI/MENA community or any culturally specific community, but I speak mostly to the ANHPI/MENA community, there is a dearth of data. There is no data that breaks it down further into South Asian or East Asian or Vietnamese. And because oftentimes people may not identify with the categories that we are plugging them in. So if at your organization you collect data in a certain way, you are also engaging the community and talking about these other issues in X specific community, then you also become the educator to funders. There is one piece of, yes, we are collecting data for funders because that's what they ask, but there's also the education piece around policy that X community does not show anywhere, is not represented anywhere. So I think that is the piece that we also need to look at in terms of collecting data. And then in terms of being culturally specific, the one thing that I can say is that before we go and collect information, Krista has been polite enough to talk about if budget permits. Budget should always permit. If we're collecting data from people and hosting listening sessions, then we need to pay them for their time. And that could mean, in terms of afterwards, making sure that there is babysitting, there is food. I mean, culturally, we do everything around food, and we know that folks don't fund us. It doesn't have to be a lot, it could just be tea or coffee and cookies, but something that makes a person feel like they are human. And one last point, which is not necessarily with data collection, but it's also with intake. And this is my pet peeve. I'm not saying that all of us do it, but we also try and be professional and walk through questions. But in our communities, it's more about conversations. So you could be collecting the same data, but not doing a checklist, could possibly be just collecting data by having a conversation and filling out the form later. So just wanted to throw that in as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Sada, for jumping in. Oh, I also want to acknowledge, Anna, I saw your question in chat, and these links will be accessible through the PowerPoint. I will follow up with everyone who registered for this webinar with an email, and that will include the slides, the recording of this presentation, and then the handout that I have referenced and included in chat that has resources as well. All right. I'm just double checking chat to ensure that I didn't miss any questions or reflections from anyone. But this does conclude this presentation. Again, if you have any standing questions or individual questions for your own work, please feel free to reach out to me through the research email or to my email that I have provided in the chat. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. We will be having more webinars. There is one upcoming that is specific to needs assessment, but we will take in mind the needs that I see in chat for going through other ways of data collection and other research and evaluation concerns that you have. Again, thank you so much for your